Today's topic is the Enlightenment and the beginnings of the American Revolution. We're going to look at guys like John Locke and how they influenced American guys like Thomas Jefferson. So the question the English had was how to pay for the 7 Years' War. War's not cheap. Now it's big business and it makes a lot of money in a lot of ways, but it's not cheap. And oftentimes after a war, countries have to deal with this fact that they suddenly have a lot of war debt, or in other words, money they borrowed to pay the war. And the British had to think about a way to pay for the war. Well, one of my students the other day said, so Mr. Simpson, can we kind of blame George Washington for the French and Indian War? And the British kind of did. They kind of blamed the Americans for the war, and so they decided the Americans would have to pay the war debt. The Americans would be responsible for the payback. The Americans don't like this idea because, they weren't the only guys fighting. The British fought, the French fought, the Indians fought. And also, William Pitt and his three-part plan to beat the French had promised the Indians that Americans would stop going on Indian lands. And that was fine if you were an Indian, but if you were an American, this wasn't cool, and the Americans weren't happy with this idea. The Americans wanted to be able to be free to go wherever they wanted to, but still wanted the British to come save them if the Indians caused problems when they got there. So the king at the time, King George III, and Parliament decided to raise taxes on the colonies to pay for the war debt. Once again, the English kind of blamed the Americans for the war in the first place, and so the English began raising taxes on the colonists and told them, you have to pay for the war. Also, the English said, look, colonists, if y'all want protection from the Indians, you have to pay for your protection, so they raised the taxes for that also. No one ever wants their taxes raised. I know I don't, definitely. And so the Americans got upset. Now, I'll be honest, I don't blame the English for taxing them for protection from the Indians. Cops have to get paid. Soldiers have to get paid. On the other hand, the war debt thing was probably a big mistake on the English part. And so colonists weren't happy that their taxes were going up, especially because they didn't have a vote in Parliament. Remember, the English Civil War was fought in large part because the English wanted a say in their taxes, and the king wasn't giving them a say. Well, now the English have turned around and told the colonists, we're going to tax you, but we're not going to give you a say in your taxes. And so the Americans began fussing about the idea of taxation without representation. And that's going to be a major issue in the American Revolution. Well, the colonists weren't happy with the taxes, and so they began protesting. Now, protest in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad idea. It's just where, you kind of get together and you all fuss about a topic. But oftentimes when protests get big, governments decide to send in police to watch a protest, make sure it doesn't get violent. And sadly, frequently, when police show up, the bad thing happens. The violence starts. It's not the police's fault, but the protesters are already angry, and now you're adding police to the protest, which the police are there fussing, and then all of a sudden, violence breaks out. And that's what happens in Boston as a result of the tax increases. The American colonists were protesting. They were very upset over the tax situation. And while they were protesting, the British government sent in soldiers to watch the protests. Soldiers because America's a world away. They can't just send down the local cops. So they sent soldiers to watch the protest. And suddenly the protesters got a little upset. They started throwing snowballs at the soldiers. The soldiers stood there and took it. They were really, really well behaved. And that just kind of upset the colonists even more. And so some colonists started throwing sticks and stones. And at that point, it reached a problem. Nobody's really sure who fired the first shot or why the first shot was fired, if they were told to fire, if somebody tripped and fell and accidentally shot their gun, or if somebody got hit in the face and decided to shoot. But something happened, and the British soldiers began firing on the crowd, and 5 Americans got killed. Well, the Americans were furious that 5 Americans were shot and killed when they were just standing in the streets. Granted, they were throwing sticks and stones. But the Americans were really angry about this, and they called this the Boston Massacre. Now, normally a massacre is when a lot of people get killed. I don't know that 5 people qualifies, but to the Americans this was a massacre, and they were very angry. The British knew they had to do something, so they arrested the soldiers. They put the soldiers on trial, and in America, an American jury and an American lawyer decided these guys were innocent. That really they reacted like any sensible person would when a mob of crazy, angry people are throwing sticks and stones at you. So the soldiers were found innocent. After the massacre, the British began tightening down on the city of Boston. Boston seemed to be the area of America that was experiencing the most anger at this whole situation and everything. So they increased the taxes. They sent soldiers to guard the city even more. And they told the people, protest not going to happen right now. Well, a group of colonists decided that all of this was horribly unfair, that they were being horribly mistreated. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They dressed up as Indians, and they set to throwing all the tea that was in the city of Boston on the boats into the ocean. Now, to understand why this is a problem, you need to realize, first off, the British guys, they really like tea. It's like the drink. It's like Pepsi. The nectar of the gods. Plus, during this time period, tea was really expensive. It's not like you could go down to Walmart and buy some. You had to pay some dude to sail around the world, find you some tea, buy you some tea, sail back, and not be attacked by pirates, not have a shipwreck, not be lost in a storm. So tea was expensive. And the Americans were just throwing it in the water. Now, they dressed up as Indians, not because they wanted to get Indians in trouble. Nobody thought it was Indians that really did this. They dressed up as Indians, though, so nobody could identify them. Just this weekend, I was listening to the news, and they were talking about how this guy and his buddy decided to rob Wendy's. Now, to be honest, if you're robbing Wendy's, you've probably got bigger problems you need to be addressing in the first place. But they went in with bandanas covering their faces, and one of the guys was really polite, very soft-spoken, not very loud. And none of the people in the store could hear what he was saying, and they said, hey, dude, we can't understand you. And so the guy lifted his bandana off so everybody could hear him better, of course revealing his identity. These guys at the Boston Tea Party, they were a little smarter than that. They dressed up as Indians to hide. The Enlightenment has happened, though, and the American colonists, they weren't stupid. During this time period, people actually studied, and people actually read things, and they read about the Enlightenment, and they saw all the things that the Enlightenment guys had talked about. They looked at the fact that Locke taught that if a government begins trampling your rights, and the Americans said the British were, that you should fight back. Americans were getting shot in the streets, for one reason or another. Their liberty was being taken. They were being told they couldn't protest. And their property was being taken, which was another big thing that Locke liked to talk about, life, liberty, and property. Their property was being taken in taxes that they had no say on. So the Americans were beginning to think that the English had lost sight of the Enlightenment, and the Americans are ready to stand for the enlightened ideas. So the colonists write a letter to the king, asking to preserve their rights and freedoms, asking for the king to remember the idea of the Enlightenment, to remember the freedoms that all Englishmen were supposed to share. They call this letter the Olive Branch Petition. They call it the Olive Branch Petition because olive branches are an internationally regarded sign of peace. The goal is to get the king and the parliament and the colonist on good speaking terms. And the king thought it was hilarious. He laughed it off and told them they were crazy. At that point, Thomas Jefferson and several others were tasked with writing what's called the Declaration of Independence. There were 5 guys that did this. These 5 guys looked at Locke. They looked at all the things Locke said, and they copied those ideas. Almost word for word at times. Locke talked about life, liberty, and property, and Jefferson talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, 2 of the 5 guys involved in the signing or writing of the Declaration of Independence, spent a lot of time in France. They had both moved to France and studied about the Enlightenment from Enlightenment guys still alive. Now Locke was dead by this point, but several of the other guys were alive, and Jefferson and Franklin hung out with them. They actually partied. Benjamin Franklin was a big party animal. The ladies loved him, and he loved them. Now somebody in my 3rd period said, Mr. Simpson, he's really kind of an ugly guy. And I don't disagree. He's not, what I would think of as a cute guy if I were to think about cute guys. But the women, for some reason, they were just crazy about Benjamin Franklin. He was a party animal. And so Jefferson and Franklin, they learned about the Enlightenment from the Enlightenment philosophers themselves, and they brought those ideas back to America and the Declaration of Independence.